Welcome to DAC Goose for SQL Showpiece Shout Old and New. My name is Heidi Wilson and I'm a SQL Server consultant and Microsoft certified trainer with Wardy IT Solutions. I've been working with SQL Server for over 10 years. I often present at SQL Server events and I specialise in the design and implementation of highly available and disaster recoverable SQL Server solutions. I blog at sqlskirt.com. You can find me on Twitter at sqlskirt and my email is sqlskirt@gmail.com. DAC Goose covers one of the most critical functionalities in SQL Server, the dedicated administrator connection. This demo covers what the DAC is, default configuration and customizations, how to connect to the DAC, restrictions, and variations for SQL Server versions and additions. You'll learn all you need to know about the DAC, so SQL Server won't make a goose of you. We've had the DAC functionality in SQL Server since version 2005, and it can be used to connect to a SQL Server instance when it is not responding to standard connection requests. In this situation, the DAC allows an administrator to connect to an instance of SQL Server to troubleshoot and diagnose problems. Now, the DAC may not always be able to connect. Under extreme situations when the DAC is unable to connect, a restart of SQL Server may be required. However, first attempt connecting using the DAC, as you may avoid having to do that restart of SQL Server. Let's take a look at the default configuration for the DAC and how we can apply customizations. So we have Management Studio open and we are connected to a default instance of SQL Server. Now you may be wondering why I'm doing a demo against a 2005 instance. You're thinking this version isn't even in support anymore. Well, our SQL Showpiece theme is old and new, so this demo covers both old and new versions of SQL Server. The functionality of the DAC is consistent across all versions, with an additional configuration tool in 2005. So if we come in here and expand the management node and then our SQL Server logs node, we're going to take a look at our active SQL Server log. So if we double click on the current SQL Server log, and about halfway down this screen you'll see we have an entry here mentioning the dedicated admin connection. So this is where it tells you how it is currently configured. So you can see that we're listening locally, which means that in order to connect to SQL Server using the DAC, we must be logged on to the server where SQL Server is installed. We cannot use the DAC across the network at this stage to connect to our SQL Server instance. You can also see the port that SQL Server is listening on for the DAC, and it is that default port of 1434. Now, if you didn't have access to Management Studio, you can still obtain this information through the file system. So in Windows Explorer, we're just going to navigate to our SQL Server instance directory, and in our log folder here, you'll see we've got our error logs in file format. We're just going to right click on that first error log file and open it in Notepad, and just around halfway down the page you'll see our dedicated admin connection entry there with the same information that it's listening locally on port 1434. So that's just an alternative way that you can obtain the configuration of the DAC. Now, for those familiar with supporting SQL Server 2005 instances, you will know of a tool called the Surface Area Configuration tool. This tool is another way of managing remote network connections for the DAC. So if we open up this tool and click on our Surface Area Configuration for features, you'll see a list of the features that we can manage through this tool. and right here is the DAC. So it shows you here the options that we have, which is simply just enabling remote network connections. So this way of managing that for the DAC is only available for SQL Server 2005. This tool was removed in later versions of SQL Server, so we'll now have a look at how you manage it for those versions, and this is also supported for 2005. So what we need to do is use our sp_configure stored procedure in order to manage the remote network connection configuration for our DAC. So if we just go ahead and execute that stored proc, you'll see a list of configurations that are returned. Now these are just the standard ones. We haven't enabled show advanced options, but the remote admin connections is just a standard configuration, so we don't need to enable show advanced options in order to manage it. So you can see it here, it's currently disabled. So the next statement here is what we need to run in order to manage our remote admin connections. So if we just change our flag to a 1 and then we execute that, that will enable remote admin connections, and in order for that change to take effect we just need to run our reconfigure statement, and then if we have a look at our list of configurations, our remote admin connections is now set to 1, which means that it is enabled. So this is the way to manage the remote admin connections for the DAC in all versions of SQL Server that have the DAC. But alternatively in SQL Server 2005 you can use the surface area configuration tool. Another customization that we can make is to change the port number that SQL Server listens on for the DAC, and to do that we do need to make a registry change. So we need to open up our registry editor and navigate to this path down the bottom. And in this path we will have a key called our TCP dynamic ports. So if we modify that key, we can simply just put our non-default port number in there. So I'm just changing my port number to 51434, and you can see that change has taken effect. But for it to actually be, for SQL Server to actually change to listen on that port, we may have to do a restart. If we hadn't enabled remote admin connections prior to changing this port number, then a restart of SQL Server is not required. But because we have enabled our remote network connections for the DAC prior to changing the port number, we will need to do a restart of SQL Server in order for that change to take effect. So I have done a restart of SQL Server. If we have a look in our active SQL Server log now, you'll see that our dedicated admin connection does support remote network connections. It's listening remotely, and it is listening on that non-default port number of 51434. So let's have a look at connecting to our SQL Server instance using the DAC. So the first thing I'm going to do is connect using SQL CMD. So I've opened up a command prompt, and for default instances of SQL Server we can simply just type in SQL CMD -A. And this connects us to our default instance of SQL using the DAC. And then we can execute a command that might give us more information about why our SQL Server instance is not accepting standard connection requests. That just gives us some information about the processes that are currently connected to SQL Server. If we are working with a named instance of SQL Server, the syntax is slightly different. So again, we're using SQL CMD. This time we're using the -S parameter followed by admin : and then our instance name. Now I'm going to use this syntax to connect to my default instance because I don't have a named instance here. But if you did, you'd simply just append a backslash character and then your instance name on the end. So let's remove that and we'll go ahead and connect to our SQL Server instance. And again, we can run some diagnostic queries to determine what's going on with SQL Server. Now, one of the things that you need to keep in mind is when a connection request goes through to SQL Server, the login that you're using will have a default database configured. Now, if SQL Server is running, then the master database will be available. However, your login may be configured to have a different default database, which means that when you connect using that login, it's going to try and connect through to that default database. So it's highly recommended when you do connect using the DAC that you do specify a default database of master, because if that connection is established, then it can be guaranteed that the master database is available. However, if you're using a login with a different default database configured, that database may not be available and your connection may not be established successfully. So how we specify the default database to be master is simply just adding additional parameter onto our sqlcmd command line. So if we go back to our last sqlcmd connection and we add a -d parameter and then type our default database of master, that will ensure that our connection goes through to the master database, even if our login is configured with a default database of something other than master. And again, we can start to run those diagnostic queries. Now, another way that we can connect to our SQL Server instance using the DAC is through Management Studio. However, it is not the standard way that we would connect. So normally we would connect through to the SQL Server instance using this connection option, and in order to connect using the DAC in Management Studio, it's simply admin : and then our instance name. But we get an error trying to connect to the DAC saying that DAC connections are not supported. So we cancel out of that. Now if we try a new query and we change our connection here so that we're connecting using the DAC, so again we're using admin : and our instance name, we get a connection established. Now the reason for that is that a query window will only establish one connection through to SQL Server, whereas connecting the other way through Object Explorer, it requires multiple connections through to SQL Server, and the DAC will only support one connection. So if you do want to use Management Studio over sqlcmd, you need to do your connection through a new query window and not through the Object Explorer. Now again, we can start to run our diagnostic queries to determine why SQL Server is not accepting those standard connection requests. So we'll just have a look at some of the DAC restrictions or considerations with SQL Server. Only one DAC per instance of SQL Server is supported. So if somebody is already connected to SQL Server using the DAC, you will not be able to come along and establish a DAC connection. If you are using a non-standard static port number for SQL Server to listen for the DAC, you must be running the SQL browser service. For SQL Server Express editions, in order to use the DAC, you must enable trace flag 7806 prior to being able to connect to SQL Server using the DAC. Now once you've connected to SQL Server using the DAC, parallel queries and commands are not supported. So for example, backup and restore operations will not be possible. SQL Server only reserves a limited amount of resources for the DAC, so you need to avoid running any resource-intensive operations. It really is just for performing those troubleshooting and diagnostic type queries to determine why SQL Server isn't accepting those standard connection requests. So just to highlight some variations between SQL Server versions and editions, there's just a couple. So as we saw, SQL Server 2005 supports configuring network connections for the DAC from the surface area configuration tool. This tool was removed in later versions of SQL Server, so it is only supported in 2005. However, all versions from 2005 through to 2014 do support managing network connections for the DAC by using the sp_configure stored procedure. The other variation is with SQL Server Express Edition. So if you are supporting Express Editions, you will need to enable trace flag 7806 before you can use the DAC. So here's just some references for using the dedicated administrator connection. There's one for each version of SQL Server that does have this functionality. So hopefully I've given you guys enough information around using the DAC so that in the event that your SQL Server instance stops accepting standard connection requests, you can still connect to your instance through the dedicated administrator connection and hopefully avoid having to perform a restart. Make sure you check out sqlshowpiece, the SQL Server vlog, a portal for SQL Server video demos and a collaboration of supporting content such as scripts and slides. If you've done something with SQL Server that's too cool to keep to yourself, then we want you to share your SQL Showpiece with others. This is a great opportunity to contribute to the SQL Server community and raise your profile as a SQL Server professional. Find out all you need to know at sqlshowpiece.com. You can follow us on Twitter at sqlshowpiece, and if you'd like to contact us by email, we're at sqlshowpiece@gmail.com.